Julian Assange's extradition trial and Espionage Act indictment are some of the most consequential attacks on free speech and journalism in the United States ever. It's the first time the Espionage Act has been used against a publisher, not just a whistleblower, and I thought it'd be interesting to do a little media comparison. So we have MSNBC, who spends a lot of time worrying about press freedom, justifiably so. They don't want journalists to go to jail for doing journalism, and Democracy Now! Doesn't want that either. But the two news outlets obviously have a lot of differences, so let's examine those. Quick refresher, Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, helped Chelsea Manning retrieve a bunch of information from the US, some of which had to do with the Iraq and Afghanistan war. Assange was indicted under the Espionage Act. He's in London, but the US is trying to get London to send him over here so that we can put him in jail for the rest of his life.
Assange faces 18 charges of attempted hacking and breaches of the Espionage Act for his role in publishing classified documents exposing U.S. war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. He could be sentenced to up to 175 years in prison.
I am not a fan of Julian Assange. I view Assange as more of an anti-American anarchist, a man who hid from rape allegations from 2 women, which he denied.
There are a lot of things you could explore pertaining to this case, but Assange's character isn't really one of them. By the way, Swedish government ended their sexual assault investigation, and he was never charged. His allegiance to America also doesn't matter. I mean, he's Australian. It actually doesn't matter who he is or what he's done outside of the indictments. Just like if I want to talk about Joy Reid's coverage of the Assange trial, there's no reason to bring up the fact that she wrote homophobic blog posts years ago that, once discovered, she tried to claim were actually planted by hackers. The only thing that would come from that is the poisoning of her image, which, why would I do that if I'm trying to get you mad that this person is being criminalized? And are you going to be more or less likely to go to a protest on Assange's behalf after I try to convince you that he's terrible? So, just the way the stories are set up on MSNBC not only indicate bias, but actually diminish how you could possibly end up perceiving the threat that they're ostensibly trying to communicate. Democracy Now! Doesn't do any of that, even in the other direction. Obviously, they could gush about how brave he is, what a journalistic hero he is, but they don't really do that because it's not pertinent and there isn't enough time for it anyway, especially on a show that is only an hour long. If MSNBC wanted to devote an entire hour straight to Assange, then I guess a more thorough bio would be okay, but that's not what they do. The background that Democracy Now! Does give is his imprisonment.
And just to be clear, Julian Assange, from being under house arrest in Britain to holing up in the Ecuadorian embassy for over 7 years, to being at Belmarsh, the high-security prison, for a year and a half, has been actually in captivity for more than a decade.
Which is all the result of his publications. It's ultimately his punishment. The idea is that he revealed things that no country would want revealed. So this is what he, as someone who published things like this...
We got RPG. All right, we got a guy with an RPG.
Coming to fire.
02 traffic, 260.
Come on, fire.
Hey, Roger. Keep shoot.
That was a photographer for Reuters holding a camera with a big zoom lens attached, and our taxes paid for his murder. That is why Assange has been in captivity, which Rachel Maddow describes like this.
The government of Ecuador was happy enough, sort of, to keep hosting him in that embassy as the years dragged on while he was staying there.
So in one framing, he's being held in isolation, and another framing, he's freeloading. And this is kind of a good example of how this pristinely unbiased journalism doesn't really exist. You can spin it one way or the other. Then there's this idea floating around that he's not a real journalist at all.
But Julian Assange is a hacker, not a journalist.
What is a real journalist? I mean, if you needed to do some hacking in order to break a big story and you have the ability, you wouldn't? Of course you would. The other DOJ line that MSNBC basically accepts is that Assange helped to steal the documents he leaked because he encouraged Chelsea Manning to get them.
I can't count the number of times I've been asked for documents, as was quite proper for journalists. So that conspiracy is something that every source goes through with every journalist who uses sources.
The guests on Democracy Now! Are pretty obvious. You have Daniel Ellsberg. He was on a couple times, famous for the Pentagon Papers, and he was charged similarly to Assange and faced 115 years in prison. There's also Assange's lawyer. Makes sense. The authors of the book In Defense of Julian Assange and Assange himself. The perspective of guests is important, and these are all people who have extensive dealing with whistleblowers or have written on the topic or are actual whistleblowers. When you think about it, it's kind of crazy that MSNBC hasn't had Daniel Ellsberg on, the most famous whistleblower. They reference the Pentagon Papers, but haven't bothered inviting the guy on. It would be like doing a show about British comedy and not inviting on anyone from Monty Python. And conversely, the guest list on MSNBC is just inferior. Dave Marinis, Phil Rucker, Ruth Marcus, people from the Washington Post who are mostly on all the time anyway, Gabriel Schoenfeld, who's actually called for journalists to be tried under the Espionage Act before, Ken Delanian, who was disavowed by the LA Times after it came out that he was a CIA collaborator. No particular reason to have these people on, certainly not about this particular thing. And okay, yes, there were a few good people on. Mehdi Hasan from The Intercept, he's great. Chris Hayes had on Jamil Jaffer, who's actually willing to acknowledge that using the Espionage Act to stifle journalism wasn't started by Trump, only refined, and that Obama used it more than any other administration. Obviously, critiques of Obama are extremely rare on MSNBC, but how the fuck do you expect to warn people about the war on journalism when you only call out half the Axis power? But you definitely didn't have many people willing to do this or dispense with the caveats and just defend Julian Assange for what it means for journalism and for what he brought to light. Now, MSNBC will get people all mad about how Trump violated the Hatch Act by accepting the Republican nomination at the White House. So we paid for that to happen. Well, Assange exposed things that taxpayers also paid for. And I bet we paid a lot more to blow that photographer away from a helicopter than we paid for catering at the RNC. I'm not saying don't be mad about the Hatch Act. I'm just saying that if you've spent more time feeling angry about one than the other, it might be time to recalibrate your rage a little bit. But that is critical context. Because if we're not talking about Assange being targeted, then the whole thing being a threat to journalism is just kind of theoretical. It may happen to something to real journalists in the future, but it's not theoretical. This is FLAC. This is Filter 4 of manufacturing consent. The idea is that punishment is dealt out for disseminating information. Assange exposed war crimes. They don't like that. They want everyone at the New York Times and the Washington Post to know that anyone who exposes war crimes like this could go to jail forever. Even after Trump, under Biden or whoever, people who publish leaks about war crimes can still have their lives ruined. So the language and details of these reports are really important as well for how audiences receive them. Democracy Now! Played a clip of Assange's dad.
American Department of Justice. Julian is an Australian citizen, the publications are in the United Kingdom, and yet he's kidnapped and judicially abducted to the United States to spend 175 years in jail.
Australian citizen who published in the UK was judicially kidnapped. That is very different from just using a word like extradition, which has no emotional value.
This month, as a result of the COVID shutdown, he hasn't had any social or legal visits since the pandemic broke out, which has left him incredibly isolated in prison. And it was surprising to us to see that he has lost a lot of weight.
Julian hasn't had any social or legal visits since the pandemic broke out. Again, these details are important because MSNBC frames this as kind of a potential future threat. But the reality is, Assange is already being punished for doing journalism. And highlighting what was contained in said journalism would seem important. MSNBC really only mentions in passing the actual content of the leaks.
Julian Assange led WikiLeaks as it exposed revelations about the Iraq and Afghanistan war.
So it's the difference between saying that Assange exposed revelations about Iraq and Afghanistan and, as Democracy Now! Has done, showing the revelations, which is footage of the military killing innocent people. Both reports are true, neither are lying, and yet they are very different. Okay, so the last thing I want to bring up is that the time you spend talking about something in relation to everything else you're talking about indicates how important it is to you. If you spend more time prefacing how much you don't like Assange than you spend explaining his revelations about war crimes, then I don't think it's really too much to say that someone like Joy Reid cares more about tearing down Assange's character than she does about war crimes. And overall time is important too, so it's not as if Democracy Now! Is giving Assange 30 minutes a day. They only broadcast for 5 hours a week. But thus far in 2020, as far as I can tell, Democracy Now! Has given at least twice the time to this case as MSNBC has. And MSNBC has 128 hours of original broadcasting a week. And those are what I think the differences are. Of course, you probably could have done this comparison using any corporate outlet against any independent outlet, and would have come out almost the same. So if you found this helpful or entertaining, please subscribe. It helps other people find this. And next up is The Rachel Maddow Show. How's it going, Rachel?
Good evening, Chris. Thanks, my friend. Much appreciated.
I'm not Chris.
And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour.